Keir Starmer's leadership crisis, the unexpected political shakeup shifting Britain's future. Keir Starmer, once riding high after his party's landslide victory in July, now faces what may be the biggest political challenge of his career. Yes, you heard that right. Just 4 months into his role, Starmer's decisions and policies are causing ripples throughout the United Kingdom, with consequences some are calling catastrophic. This isn't just a political setback, it's a full-blown crisis. Today we'll take you through the latest on this story, diving into what's driving this shift in public sentiment and why the Conservative Party has made an unexpected comeback under the new leadership of Kemi Badenoch. But before we dive into the details, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and join our growing community of political enthusiasts. Now, let's get into it. A shocking turn in British politics. In a surprising twist, the Conservatives have taken a 2-point lead in the latest polls, surging to 29% of voter support compared to Labour's 27%. This marks the first time in months that the Tories have outperformed Labour, especially following Labour's landslide victory in July, when they captured 34% of the vote and a 174-seat majority, dealing the Conservatives their worst election loss in history. The change comes as Badenoch, the recently elected Tory leader, pushes forward with a different vision. Despite initial doubts about her experience and popularity, Badenoch has made swift, decisive moves that seem to be winning over the public. Kemi Badenoch's bounce. What's behind her polling boost? For a party once trailing far behind, the Conservatives' poll comeback under Badenoch's leadership is remarkable. The new Tory leader's appeal seems to rest on her policy stances and a willingness to present fresh, decisive ideas, positioning her party as a contrast to Labour's controversial economic decisions. Her net approval rating has reached -3, significantly higher than Starmer's -25 rating, indicating she's resonating with the public in ways the Labour leader currently isn't. However, Badenoch's rise is intriguing because only 1 in 3 people report being familiar with her policies, suggesting her early support might come from people's dissatisfaction with Labour rather than her specific actions. Labour's economic policies fueling public dismay. One major source of the public's disappointment in Labour has been the fallout from Rachel Reeves's controversial £40 billion tax reform. Reeves's tax policies, which were designed to raise substantial revenue for government initiatives, have faced backlash for disproportionately affecting farmers, business owners, and everyday taxpayers. Labour's inheritance tax reforms have been particularly contentious, sparking fears among rural communities about their future viability. As protests and criticism mount, Labour's popularity has plummeted, and Badenoch's Conservatives have capitalized on this discontent. The tax hike impacting farmers and small businesses. A major point of contention in Reeves's tax package is the planned inheritance tax on agricultural assets, set to come into effect in 2026. Under this policy, farms and other agricultural assets valued above £1 million will face a 20% inheritance tax rate, posing serious financial challenges for small to medium-sized family farms. This change has drawn widespread criticism from farming communities and agricultural organizations, who argue that it threatens the viability of family farms, some of which have been passed down for generations. This policy has prompted thousands of farmers to organize protests in London, scheduled for later this month, hoping to draw attention to what they see as an existential threat to the agricultural sector. Labour's push to increase employer national insurance contributions from 13.8% to 15% has further strained its relationship with both rural and urban voters. Many see this as a broken manifesto promise, with businesses warning that the increased costs will ultimately reduce wages for employees. Britain's largest business organizations have accused the government of betraying working people, expressing concern that the national insurance hike will harm the economy, reduce consumer spending, and make it harder for businesses to survive in the current economic climate. Reform, UK, and other parties on the rise. The political landscape has shifted significantly with the rise of Reform UK, which has seen a steady increase in public support, reaching 19% in recent polls. Led by Nigel Farage, Reform UK has positioned itself as an alternative to both Labour and the Conservatives, capitalizing on voters' growing disillusionment with the traditional parties. The Liberal Democrats, meanwhile, have seen a slight drop, now standing at 11%, while the Green Party remains steady at 8%. Farage has pointed out that the growing popularity of Reform UK reflects a desire for a more proportional representation system, a call echoed by political analysts who argue that the current first-past-the-post system fails to represent the country's increasingly diverse political preferences. The crisis in rural communities, a death sentence for family farms? As the details of Labor's inheritance tax reform have unfolded, concerns about its impact on family farms have intensified. A recent report by the Country Land and Business Association, CLA, paints a grim picture. A typical 200-acre farm in England, which generates an estimated annual profit of £27,300, could face an inheritance tax bill of £427,000 upon the death of its owner. The CLA has warned that to cover this tax, farm owners may have to sell significant portions of their land, potentially up to 20% of their total acreage, which would likely render their farms unviable. This issue has touched a nerve, with farming communities across the country voicing their outrage. Former Labor advisor John McTernan's recent comment that we can do to farmers what Thatcher did to the miners has sparked backlash, with critics accusing Labor of attacking the farming industry out of ideological motives rather than economic necessity. Farmers argue that this policy, far from targeting the wealthy, will devastate middle-income families who rely on their farms as their primary livelihood and cannot easily afford the new tax burden. Mental health concerns in the farming community. The emotional toll on farming families cannot be overstated. Many elderly farmers are reportedly experiencing profound anxiety about the possibility of having to sell parts of their land or watch their families lose their farms due to inheritance taxes. Tim Bonner, chief executive of the rural advocacy group Countryside Alliance, has highlighted the mental health crisis unfolding in these communities. For many farmers, the thought of losing the land that has been in their family for generations is heartbreaking, and the uncertainty surrounding these tax changes has only heightened their distress. Labor's response: attempts to reframe the tax as a wealth tax. Labor has defended its policies by framing the inheritance tax as a tax on wealth, arguing that it primarily targets high-value properties and assets. However, the farming community, represented by organizations like the CLA, counters that the tax will hit middle-class families hardest. Many argue that family farms may be worth millions on paper, but generate modest profits, and the new tax will ultimately lead to the sale of farmland and family properties. Critics say the tax is based on a flawed assumption that large land holdings are synonymous with wealth, ignoring the unique economic realities of the farming industry. The nuanced impact on farming couples and widows. The inheritance tax does provide some relief for married couples, allowing them to claim extra tax benefits, but it still presents challenges. For widows and single landowners, the tax poses even greater difficulties, with no immediate relief available. This has raised concerns about the policy's lack of flexibility for people in different life circumstances, including widows and those who inherit land shortly after a loved one's passing. Critics argue that Labor's policy lacks the nuance needed to address these varied realities, and many feel that it fails to understand or appreciate the significance of family-owned farmland. What's next for Labor and Starmer? As Labor struggles to respond to these challenges, Starmer's leadership is under increased scrutiny, with the Conservatives now polling ahead and a significant portion of the public expressing discontent with Labor's economic policies. Starmer's tenure faces new uncertainties. Badenoch's rise as a formidable Tory leader poses additional challenges, and her appeal as a fresh voice may continue to draw voters away from Labor if they don't adjust their strategies. For Starmer, addressing these economic and cultural concerns is essential if he hopes to retain the support Labor gained just a few months ago. The stakes for Labor are high, and the party's response to these criticisms in the coming weeks will likely shape its future trajectory. The Conservatives, for their part, are eager to capitalize on this moment, with Badenoch's leadership giving the party a newfound energy and purpose. As Labor faces mounting pressure from rural and urban voters alike, the next few months may determine whether this government can regain public trust or if Badenoch's Conservatives are truly poised for a comeback. A perfect storm for Labor, rising discontent. The rapid decline in Labor's public support over the past few months has caught many political analysts off guard, especially given the optimism surrounding the party's landslide victory in the 2024 election. In just a few short months, Labor has gone from being on the cusp of a new era of governance to facing a leadership crisis that is largely of its own making. Keir Starmer, once seen as a steady hand steering the party away from the chaos of the Jeremy Corbyn years, now faces mounting pressure from within and outside his party. The policies being championed by his government are deeply unpopular, particularly among key voter blocs like farmers, small business owners, and working-class families. The inheritance tax reforms, which were hailed by Labor as a much-needed way to raise revenue for public services, have turned into a political disaster. The broader tax hike plan, including the rise in employer national insurance contributions, has intensified criticisms of Labor's economic strategy. While Starmer's team argues that these tax changes are necessary to plug the fiscal holes left by the Conservatives, many see them as a blunt instrument that unfairly punishes middle-income families and businesses, especially in rural areas. The backlash has led to a noticeable shift in voter sentiment as people who once supported Labor begin to look elsewhere for political leadership. Historical context: Labor's shifting approach to rural Britain. Labor's relationship with rural Britain has always been complex. Historically, the party has struggled to connect with voters in rural areas, where agriculture and small businesses are key to the local economy. For many years, Labor was seen as the party of urban Britain, focused on industrial workers, social welfare, and public services. However, after the 2019 general election, which saw the party lose crucial rural constituencies to the Conservatives, Starmer's leadership appeared to be a step in the right direction. The Labour Party sought to recalibrate its image, focusing on bridging the urban-rural divide. But now, with the introduction of policies like the inheritance tax increase on farms, Labour risks alienating this already skeptical voter base. Farmers and rural communities, who often feel overlooked by politicians in Westminster, are increasingly frustrated with a government that they feel doesn't understand their unique challenges. While Labor's tax reforms are framed as progressive, there's a growing perception that they are based on a misunderstanding of the agricultural sector. The ideological shift towards greater taxation on land and agricultural assets threatens not only the future of farming businesses, but also the very culture of rural Britain. The farmers' struggle, a deepening crisis. The intensifying crisis in Britain's farming sector is particularly evident in the farming community's response to Labor's inheritance tax policy. As previously mentioned, many farming families are now in a state of dread, fearing that they will be forced to sell off significant portions of their land to cover inheritance tax bills. The notion that generations of farmers could lose their land to a tax bill is a deeply emotional issue, one that strikes at the heart of rural life in Britain. The CLA's modeling on the potential impact of the inheritance tax increase paints a grim picture. Farms that currently generate modest profits will be hit hard by the tax burden, particularly those in areas where land values have inflated due to market pressures, but where profits are often thin due to the capital-intensive nature of farming. This new policy will force many to consider whether they can continue farming or whether it's more financially viable to sell their land. The consequences of these decisions could fundamentally alter the landscape of British agriculture. Conclusion: the political shakeup of 2024. The political landscape in the UK is shifting at an unprecedented pace, with Keir Starmer's Labour Party facing a crisis of its own making. Labour's inheritance tax reforms and other controversial policies have alienated key voter blocs, while Kemi Badenoch's Conservative Party has gained new ground. The next few months will be crucial for both parties as they vie for support in an increasingly volatile political environment. Whether Labour can recover, or whether the Conservatives under Badenoch can continue to capitalize on the discontent remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: British politics has entered a new era, and the stakes have never been higher.